James, in the context of current situation, there is a growing argument across the Muslim world that Jesus was a Palestinian. What do you think? Do you think Jesus was an Israeli or a Palestinian?
That's a really interesting question right now. And one of the most important things we can do with that is not think anachronistically, meaning we can't superimpose our current view of the world onto the past.
Now you might say, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is in Palestine, therefore Jesus was Palestinian.
So the question is, where does the term Palestinian come from? Palestinian comes from Hebrew, and it's describing a group of people who settled on the western coast of Canaan in about 1000 BC, 3,000 years ago. And they probably intermingled with the local population and then formed a regional power that was the dominant regional power at the time of King Saul, the first king of Israel. There's constant battles between Saul and the Philistines, and Saul loses his life fighting the Philistines. Then David is famous for slaying Goliath, the Philistine champion. And when he becomes king, he has many victories against the Philistines and eventually subjugates them and brings them into his kingdom. That doesn't mean he took over and made them Israel. What it means is they stayed Philistines, but they paid David tribute. And they also paid tribute to Solomon, David's son, and kept paying tribute to the throne of Israel until eventually they got their own independence. But this wouldn't last for long because Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came and defeated Judah, sacked Jerusalem, sent everyone into exile, and then he did the same thing to Gaza and the Philistine cities as well. And when the Babylonians would conquer people, they would send them to different countries so they had no more connection to their homeland. But this was only temporary because 70 years later, Cyrus, king of Persia, destroyed Babylon and basically sent the Jews back to Judea. Now, we don't know this for sure, but it's very plausible that people who had been taken from the Philistines' cities made their way back to them as well. Then, at the time of Alexander the Great, Gaza was sacked by Alexander, and all the men were killed, and all the women and children were sold into slavery, and then he resettled it with people from the surrounding area. In the Greek era, Gaza became this hub of Greek and Arab culture because it was right on the edge of the Nabatean Empire, which were an empire of traders based in Petra and Madain Saleh in Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And it was part of the Greek world too, so the culture would thrive there. Now, in this time, the Jews managed to reestablish their own independent kingdom, but that didn't last long because they were eventually annexed into the Roman Republic. Jesus lived in the Roman province of Judea, and what we know from the New Testament and other contemporary sources like Josephus' Antiquity of the Jews, that there were three main groups that existed at the time. There were the Jews, there were the Gentiles, and then there were Samaritans. The Jews were the largest ethnic group, and the Samaritans were sort of a subset of people who were descended from the original Israelites who intermarried with local people and had developed syncretistic practices. And the Jews and the Samaritans hated each other. The Jews and the Gentiles had a distant but functional relationship. Gaza, at the time, is mentioned in the New Testament in Acts chapter 8, but not in any detail. But at the time, Gaza would have been a Gentile city which had a mix of Greeks, of Romans, of Arabs, and probably descendants of the Philistines still living there as well. Whether anybody would have called themselves a Philistine or not, it's pretty unlikely, but not impossible. At the time, the convention is really to name yourself by the city you're from. So you see Jesus being referred to as Jesus of Nazareth or the Galilean. So a Gazan at the time would have probably referred to themselves as a Gazan or a Gazaite. Probably wouldn't have used the term Palestinian or Philistine, although it's not completely impossible. However, it's almost certain that Jesus would never have used the term Philistine to describe himself, since it's never mentioned in the New Testament, and they're always seen as a different group than the Jews in the Old Testament. However, we do see Jesus use the term Israelite in John chapter 1 to describe one of his disciples. We see that he identifies as a Jew in John chapter 4, and Matthew 2:20 refers to the Roman province of Judea as the land of Israel. So Jesus would have considered himself Jewish, he would have considered himself an Israelite. So does that mean that Palestinians have no historical claim on Jesus? I don't think it does, and let me explain why. I'm from England, And one of my favorite historical figures is Alfred the Great, the English king who defeated the Vikings and reformed the nation's laws. However, he wasn't really an English king. He was king of the West Saxons in Wessex. And aspirationally, he wanted to be the king of the Angles and the Saxons. The type of English that Alfred spoke would be so different than mine. In order for me to communicate with him, I'd need both a time machine and a translator. Nevertheless, many things that Alfred did would later affect British culture and transform the nation. So I think it's entirely legitimate to see him as an ancestor of the British people on a cultural level, even though his worldview and language would be different to modern England. In the same way, I believe there's many ways that Jesus had an impact on Palestinian culture. In 138 AD, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans exiled all the Jews from Judea and renamed the province of Judea Syria Palestina. And over the next 400 years, it went from a generally polytheistic place to a generally Christian province as more and more people became Christians. And I can promise you that as those Christians read the Bible, as they practiced their faith, they probably took great joy in thinking of Jesus walking the same hills and streets that they themselves walked in their country. And Syria Palestine kept that Christian identity until the Islamic conquests, where it was renamed Quds. Nevertheless, many Christian Palestinians remained in the land. However, if you take a step back and drop the labels for a minute and think about this, there's actually a lot of parallels between the life of Jesus and the average Palestinian living today. In that, the Jews of Jesus' time lived in their historic homeland, but did not have sovereignty over it. And they hadn't had sovereignty over it for about 70 years. That's how long the Roman occupation had been there. And while they had access to their holy place, they were constantly afraid that they were going to lose it because it was controlled by the Roman government. You had military checkpoints making people go from different places to different places, and constantly everything was on the edge of rebellion and the corresponding crackdowns that would come with this. In fact, if you read the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 19, it almost sounds like he's describing Gaza.
And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you because you did not know the time of your visitation."
So I think it's entirely legitimate for a modern Palestinian to read the life of Jesus and find a kindred spirit there. What you absolutely cannot do, though, is shoehorn Jesus into a modern political cause. Because people tried to do that at the time of Jesus, and he'd never tolerate it. So, for example, at one time, people tried to make him king by force, and he completely refused. Another time, he was explaining to Peter, his disciple, how he was going to die on the cross and be raised from the dead. And Peter, who was in the mindset of his day, and that mindset was, we need a violent savior who are going to push our oppressors into the sea. Peter says, no, this will never happen to you. But Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, because you're not putting your mind on the things of God. Peter continues to miss the point that when Jesus is arrested, Peter takes out his sword and cuts off someone's ear. And Jesus says, Peter, put your sword back in its place, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword. What you see over and over again from Jesus is that he refuses to get pulled into the religious, social, or political divisions of his day. So Jesus is famous for interacting with Samaritans, who the Jews hated. He's also famous for being a friend of prostitutes, of tax collectors, and sinners. What people often miss about this is that the tax collectors were hated because they were collaborators with the oppressors. So Jesus would not cancel people for their political affiliations, and spent time getting to know them and loving them as individuals. This is seen so clearly when Jesus is being crucified, hung naked from a cross and mocked by Gentiles and Jews alike. He says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And this actually results in the Roman centurion overseeing his crucifixion becoming a believer. If you're Palestinian and you want to see Jesus as part of your history, you are more than welcome to do that. Because Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and he walked on the same streets and hills that your ancestors walked on. But more importantly, Jesus never turned anybody away who came to him earnestly. Now, if you want to warp Jesus into something he's not, so he fits in with a political cause, that's not going to go well for you. But if you're willing to read about Jesus yourself, learn about who he is, learn from him, and understand what he wants from you, then maybe that's the solution to everything you've been looking for.
Thanks for watching. If you have more questions, why not check out the other videos in this series? If we haven't answered your question yet, you can submit it to almeida.org/ask. We aim to answer one question every week. Like and subscribe for more content.